That's good. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Let me adjust my voice. My name is Lynn Wood, and I'm a Student Services Assistant at East Los Angeles College. And on our campus is a new center called One Zone. I'm the coordinator for that center. It's an LGBTQ plus support and retention center. It's a safe space for LGBTQ students. It's a place where I will have, once we're able to return to campus, I'll have books available for students to sort of check out while they stay in office, specifically focused on LGBTQ authors and topics. And as I mentioned, safe space. And I'm also able to connect students to different resources, either on campus and in the community. If you need help finding those resources, my email is woodcl, that's wood, W-O-O-D, C-L, @elac.edu. Feel free to send me an email and I'll try to connect you with whatever the resources are that you need or are desiring or trying to find, I should say. Let me introduce my partner. This is Anne. She's also going to read to you today. So that's what I've kind of been doing in this virtual world. I found that I'm able to connect with students best by reading. I've been reading a couple of different books. Right now I'm reading Unapologetic. Let me get back in the frame. A Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements by Charlene Carruthers. So I'll read a little bit of that today. And Anne is reading Tomboyland by Melissa Faliveno. So she's going to read from that today. And we also have some coloring. This is Anne's coloring book. And I think I'm going to continue coloring. Oh goodness, look how beautiful this is. Something Anne was working on. But I think I'm going to continue working on the page I was working on last week. So that's from this Dragonflies coloring book.
This one's actually called the Mindfulness Coloring Book. And you can see how small it is. It's good for traveling or put it in your bag and just like pull it out and color like crazy for a little while and then go on your way. Mindfully.
Yeah, so it would be good to take to a coffee shop, or if you just wanted to carry it in your backpack or something and take it out and
I don't know, coffee shop?
Yeah, you can buy a small pack of pencils to take with you. But I'm going to begin reading. I'm still reading from Unapologetic, as I mentioned. And the section, I'm on page 99, and the section says, "What do we want?" That's the section I'm going to start reading from. Let me mention, as long as we're here, that I did check. LA County Library does not have this book available, but I did see it was available at libraries in other cities, specifically in Chicago. That's where Charlene is from, and I think Oregon. Before I begin reading, I should tell you a little bit about Charlene. It's at the back of the book here. Here's her photo.
On the sleeve.
Jacket cover, sleeve, yeah. So it says she's spent a decade developing leaders, a community organizer, an educator, a Black lesbian feminist, and she's the founding national director of Black Youth Project 100, or BYP 100. It's an organization of young activists in the Black liberation movement. And then it says that her work has been featured at various news organizations, and she was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and that's where she lives today. although she tells us in the book that she's lived in various other places, but she returned to Chicago, specifically the South Side, I should say. And again, this section, I'm on page 99, and it says, what do we want? The question, reform or revolution, is often posed in activist spaces, yet I'm not convinced that this is what activists need to ask themselves. Black people in the United States have always required diverse interventions on a wide scale to make their lives livable and dignified. From Marcus Garvey's mass Black nationalism to lunch counter sit-ins in the 60s and the rise of a Black feminist movement in the early 70s, these interventions have been both deeply ideological and action-oriented. And these interventions often have left their roots in our collective angst. Angst, that feeling of anxiety, apprehension, or insecurity, can be debilitating alone, but when harnessed collectively, it can lead to the formation and operation of a block club or something much greater. Recognizing shared angst can unite people across gang borderlines, across class and gender, even across language and race. And joining that angst with shared feelings that are more positive, joy and love, to name two, can be powerful chemistry. Working to create change, especially transformative change, requires things of Black people that are both foreign and second nature to us at the same time. Working together for transformative change means shared vision, and it means that there will be moments of discomfort. As an organizer, I need to be clear about what I know well, but also about what I do not know. I must recognize when I'm out of my depth on issues, ideas, and strategies. Further, the project of anti-Blackness and colonization didn't skip over me. I have internalized ways of being and understanding just as everyone else in the world has. In my case, I grew up in a world where Blackness was narrowly defined. Gender, and as a result, womanhood and queerness, was even more narrowly defined. Fortunately, I've been pushed and agitated throughout my political development, and this has helped me to break out of my confines. Speaking of which, I learned about the concept of prison abolition from then 19-year-old Asha Ransby Sporn during the convening that led to the founding of BYP 100. It was a foreign concept to me that we could live in a world with no prison or police. I had thought of them as inevitable before then. I hope that your worldview will constantly evolve as mine has. For years in Washington, D.C. and in New York, rooted my understanding, my years, she says, my years in Washington, D.C. and New York, rooted my understanding of what is possible by ways of reform. Reforms are changes that are not structural or do not alter power relations in favor of marginalized and oppressed groups. During that time, I was rarely in conversations about what it would mean to completely transform systems that impact our lives. It was not until I joined the movement community in Chicago that I found myself in spaces where people addressed a need for radical structural change that transforms power relations. Here I found community organizers, scholars, and projects advancing their visions to not only end mass incarceration, but put an end to the entire system of incarceration. No organization impacted my understanding of this more than BYP 100.
What does that stand for again?
It stands for Black Youth Project 100, of which she's the founding national director.
Thank you.
Building the organization, particularly our work in Chicago chapter, meant building a vehicle to create the transformative change we believed in. The possibilities I found expressed in Chicago extended my personal vision for what was possible and changed what I wanted in the world. What kind of world do we want? Ooh. Sorry, everyone.
I keep feeling like I'm supposed to have a mask on. I forgot my mask.
I do suffer from allergies, so
Yeah.
it's been a tough time for me in this time of COVID-19. BYP 100, possibilities. What kind of world do we want? Our individual and collective visions both matter. Social movements over time and with much struggle have achieved various aspects of what they have envisioned, but such achievements have often been tenuous. A new political party in power can jeopardize and even destroy them. Freedoms we once thought were a given are now up for grabs. For example, Black folks continue to organize and fight for full voting rights today. It took the invalidation of one section of the Voting Rights Act by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 to strip oversight and accountability for state policies regarding public elections.
I believe that.
2013.
Yeah, I remember.
The wave of restrictive voter ID laws introduced and enacted, subsequently disenfranchising people, have been incarcerated who are incarcerated illustrate that no freedom is guaranteed in this country. This isn't limited to voting rights. Access to full reproductive health care and the ability to migrate freely without criminalization also depend on who is in political office and on the will of those running advocacy organizations with substantial resources, including labor unions and large nonprofits. Sorry, were you going to say something?
I said word.
Oh.
Like who's in office?
Yeah, speaking of which, please register to vote if you haven't registered to vote. We really need support.
Please don't be a Republican.
Joe Biden really is the best answer for our country at this time. Trump is really doing his best to bring everything out that is negative in our country. He's doing his best.
No, he's trying to hide everything that's negative.
To bring it to light, anything that is negative. He's on the news today talking about what a great person the guy is that shot people. And yeah, it's just, he doesn't see white supremacy as a problem when it obviously is.
He's obviously one of them.
Yes, yeah. He's like the leader over there, dog whistling to his supporters to come support him.
Can you believe he went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, like yesterday?
It's the guy in Wisconsin that I'm talking about that he said was a great person.
So he went over there to support them.
Right.
Yesterday.
Trying to divide our country. Please vote. Okay. Large nonprofits. We deserve more than partial freedoms cloaked as pathways to liberation. Freedom is not real if everyone can't exercise it. Liberation entails freedoms, but it also is more than that. Liberation is a perpetual project of creating and maintaining right relationships between people and the land we inhabit. And our articulation of how we get there. How we liberate ourselves matters. As activists, regardless of how much power we hold, what we say we want matters because in this moment, we just might get it. In 2014, BYP 100 released the Agenda to Keep Us Safe, a public policy agenda focused on ending the criminalization of Black people. At the time, people from all sectors of the racial justice movements proposed various reforms to address police violence. Perhaps no other reform has had as much traction as the demand to equip police officers with body cameras. We went back and forth in BYP 100 about what position to take on this. Some of our members felt strongly that we should advocate in favor of body cameras. Others felt strongly opposed to this. Today, after several cases in which police officers have been caught killing Black people on camera with impunity, read Walter Scott and Eric Garner, it may seem much easier to make a decision. If I could go back in time, I would have taken a clear stance, as I do today, against supporting the use of body cameras to deter police violence. In 2014, leaders in our organization and throughout the broader movement had differing levels of trust in the justice system. Context matters. We in BYP 100 agreed to advocate for community participation in the decision-making process before taxpayer dollars were spent on body cameras. Instead of struggling with others to advance a more transformative agenda, we compromised. Ultimately, this decision was healthier for the organization, but with hindsight, I see that we could have gone bigger. We settled on a reformist demand that failed to get to the root of the problem. Regardless of the process of the debate, body cameras would not address criminalization. Police officers can turn cameras off, claim they malfunction, or commit acts of violence only to be let off the hook by a judge or jury later. Hindsight is a gift and the source of angst. The types of demands we make do matter. Demands can be made to the state, corporations, powerful groups, individuals, and even our own communities.
Sorry, I thought I turned it off.
And even our own communities. Where were you?
Start over here.
The types of demands we make do matter. Demands can be made to the state, corporations, powerful groups, individuals, and even our own communities. Some demands are our proposed solutions to address problems. Others, such as clean water now, reparations now, books, not bars, and stop the cops and fund Black futures, articulate the vision we have for the world. The solutions we choose impact the type of change that can happen and the change that actually happens. For example, today's increasing popular demand to end mass incarceration comes after decades of grassroots activism and community organizing to raise awareness of the prison nation, the carceral state we live in. One could dissect the demand to end mass incarceration and say It is a reformist because it does not address transforming power and completely dismantling the prison industrial complex. In the vision, people will still be in cages, just fewer than there are now. And this works for the majority of mainstream advocacy efforts because most of us believe that some people deserve to be in prison. There are millions of people in prison, jail, and walking around with ankle bracelets that monitor and/or limit their movement. The people who love them are affected by this too. It's not just the people who love them that are affected by it, but it goes generations, right? Or it can carry through generations if you don't break the cycle. The immense costs of incarceration do not end with building and staffing prisons and jails. Critical Resistance, a longtime organizational leader in the global movement to end prison industrial complex, defines the prison industrial complex as the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic and social and political problems. The prison industrial complex defines as the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. That bared repeating. The PIC, or prison industrial complex, enables people to target other people based on race, gender, citizenship status, ability or lack of ability, and class. The PIC allows individuals and corporations to profit from the punishment of other people. Sounds familiar, right?
Yes.
From the media to the manufacturing of prison clothing, people profit from punishment. Our collective vision must include abolition, with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. Abolition is a demand and vision that rightly identifies the inhumane living conditions people in prison endure and the impact prison has on the families of those incarcerated. It also calls for transformative justice for victims and perpetuators of violence. These groups often overlap. Abolitionists assert that our time, energy, and resources would be better spent on building completely new alternatives instead of improving what has time and again been demonstrated to be ineffective and worse. Viewing the project through a Black queer feminist lens, community organizers can understand this as liberating for all. If we want a world in which conflict and harm are dealt with in ways radically different than they are now, look to Black queer feminists and include the experience of women, disabled people, LGBTQ people, immigrants, men who came from a lineage of people in cages. How does prison impact the environment, reproductive justice, and immigrant rights and justice? A Black queer feminist lens on questions like these? What are we building? Each generation of struggle lays the groundwork for the next. In laying the groundwork, our movements have consistently encountered many of the same battles. We fight on terrains that we do not control. The deck has been stacked against Black people in this hemisphere since the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And still we persist. Our people have built institutions and survived among people and systems set up to kill us. The imperative for today's movement is not to rest on laurels, but to instead shift the terrain we fight on. This is fundamentally connected to struggles for power. What is power? The word has many meanings. Power is the ability to act and get what you want. Power is built and maintained through organized people and organized resources. Power is not inherently good or bad. For people from marginalized groups, experiences with power are often negative. We are used to people having power over us. The amount of power other people and institutions have over our lives, our children, our mobility, our access to basic needs, food, water, shelter, and even our desire is immeasurable. Lovers, politicians, social workers, teachers, and parents can all wield oppressive power in our lives. Power relationships are based on individuals, but they are intrinsically connected to systems of power maintained by capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. A movement for collective liberation must be about changing and transforming these power relationships. This is a tall order. What type of power do we want? Creating changes requires building and harnessing power. Anyone committed to transformative change must also be committed to building transformative power. What institutions exist today where Black people organize our people and our resources? Who influences the information we receive? Who controls our resources? The answer to these questions go beyond the media and the state and entail more than how the dollar circulates in our communities. Capitalism with Black in front of it won't liberate our people. Capitalism is, by definition, tied to the subjugation of Black descended people. Our collective liberation will not come from models that rely on individual or small group wealth building. As Audre Lorde teaches, we cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Capitalism is highly adaptable, and those who want to maintain power perform any measure needed to save it each time it faces crisis. If we take up the work of prison abolition, the alternatives we have to supply and prepare to build must rely on economic and social models that benefit the greatest number of people and not just a few. Our work must center self-educated and collective education, intellectual labor, and community organizing are essential. The Black radical tradition illustrates that liberation stems from the work of organizations, scholars, and activists, not from one charismatic leader. Study, rigorous discussion, and a lifelong pursuit of knowledge are imperative for each of us. Making education and knowledge accessible to our people requires community organizing too. In a society where most people read at a 7th or 8th grade level, wow. Our political programs must address literacy and be communicated in various ways, not just in writing. Our people can understand complex ideas, though, and we should not sell ourselves out or our community short. We must work to communicate clearly, but also foster our collective ability to articulate and process complex ideas. Who has power? Today, there are far too many allowances for individuals with concentrated power to control what happens in our movement. One example is the power that philanthropic foundations have over resources owed to communities. Funding in today's movement is not based on meritocracy, as in many other sectors. It's based on relationships, visibility, and strategy. After decades of divestment from Black organizing by major foundations, movement groups are now beginning to see resources come their way again, but funding is not a given. Public foundations have money that they must spend for charitable purposes, but application requirements, program officers, and reporting requirements excessively control where and how the money should be spent. Foundations hold too much power over the resources we need to support our movement. At the same time, there are foundations like the Crossroads Fund and the Trans Justice Funding Project that are led by people rooted in the communities they support. Work needed to change the material conditions of our people is consistently underfunded, and models have been demonstrated to work remain short of resources. It is easier to write off organizations and people who receive funding from foundations than it is to have a clear understanding of how much it costs to pay for healthcare insurance and a living wage in an economy where there is no profit motive to support social change. Community organizers don't have to accept grant money, but in a capitalist economy, such work cannot be done without money. People have to feed themselves and their families. Gone are the days when one could work one job and support an entire family. We need to deeply examine the economic realities of this moment. The civil rights movement was funded by wealthy individuals. The Black Power movement received grants and funding from wealthy people such as Jane Fonda. These movements also had robust revenue generating models. Are churches a potential source of funding our movement? Selling a newspaper like the Black Panthers did is certainly no longer a viable model today. There are models for building resources through socialist frameworks. Membership dues and cooperative enterprises are examples that require skill, time, and infrastructure to implement. Public policy in the United States seems created to prevent our work from being done. Worker cooperatives are illegal in some states. In other states, traditional corporations are rewarded with tax breaks, while cooperatively owned companies are not.
It's on purpose.
Yeah, it's on purpose. It's meant to keep people down. It's meant to control people. But a lot of people don't know that. Yeah, it's working because people don't know. They don't educate themselves.
Including myself.
Including myself, yes. Community-based solutions are needed, and so are structural changes to our entire economy. Public education should receive more funding than policing and prisons. That's so true. And we're like, I know the state of California is like, I think we're 49 or 50 when it comes to funding for public education in all of the states, but we're number 13 when it comes to funding for prisons. So we put more towards prisons than we do towards educating our children in the state of California. The Freedom to Thrive report, produced by BYP 100, Law for Black Lives, and Center for Popular Democracy, found that in Baltimore, for every $100 the police department receives, public schools receive just 55 cents. For every $1 the police department receives, public schools receive 55 cents in Baltimore. The report also found that in fiscal year 2017, Chicago allocated almost 40% of its $3.7 billion general fund budget to the police department. Oh, my mouth just dropped open. And 2.1% to the Department of Family and Support Services, which includes youth mentoring, early childhood education, violence reduction, summer programs, after-school programs, and homeless services. As someone who has raised millions of dollars from foundations and individuals, I have always approached fundraising as a matter of reparations and securing what is rightfully ours. I wrestle with developing strategies that ensure that our basic financial needs are met while building alternative streams. We need access to land. We need money to pay for goods and services our families need. Whether we are building institutions or running experiments, we have to decide what exactly we're doing. If you enter the room expecting to work on a 30-year strategy while I'm expecting to craft short-term experiments, how do we work together? I'm not asking that we find a middle ground. Both approaches are necessary, but how do we connect these strategies for a larger purpose? Our movement must be flexible enough to deploy multiple tactics and disciplined enough to carry out strategies that move us towards a collective liberation. And that was the section of the book from Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements by Charlene Carruthers. If you don't have this book, I suggest you buy it today. It's available on Amazon and be shipped to you pretty quickly. It's a book that I know one of my coworkers is using as a study in her class, and I know a couple of other coworkers are also doing a study on it as well.
Science? A social science class?
It's Chicano studies.
Oh, that's kind of.
So I don't. It's kind of social studies, but yeah, it's Chicano studies in particular that the class I'm talking about. Both classes that I'm talking about. Great book. I highly recommend. Life-changing. Obviously not something to be read lightly.
No.
That's why I've just been reading sections of it. It's a lot to digest.
Yeah, it's not bad but it's not bad to sit here and color in your little, or if you like to draw, you know, bring your little colored pencils and draw and just listen to the reading.
Yeah,
it kind of works for me.
That's what we hope people are doing, and that's what you were doing, right?
Do you want me to read this still?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read, I think I'm going to finish reading an essay from Ms. Faliveno, or Ms. I guess Ms. It's so hard these days.
It's true, because, you know, I don't know about the rest of the world out there, but we were raised to say Miss or Mr.
Yes, ma'am.
Or ma'am, yeah.
And anyway, she's this is her first book of essays, and this is her picture. And she's a writer, editor, and teacher, former senior editor of a Poets magazine and other magazines. Born and raised in a small town in Wisconsin, where they're having a lot of problems right this very moment. She currently lives in Brooklyn, New York. Teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence College, and this is her first book. Her website is melissafaliveno.com if you'd like to check her out further. Okay, this is, I'm starting on page 66 where I left off last week. I want to talk about the word womanhood and what we mean when we say it. As I write this, I sit in a room alone. On my desk, I have an early edition of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. In addition to 3 books by Rebecca Solnit, both writers, women, feminist, childless, and in Woolf's case, queer. I thought she had children. Anyway.
Doesn't mean she wasn't queer.
No, but it says, anyway, makes me feel like she's saying that Virginia did not have children.
Oh.
In A Room of One's Own, originally a talk titled Professions for Women, Woolf writes famously of killing the angel in the house, the ideal woman who cooks and cleans and cares for husband and children, who serves her family and never thinks of her own needs or desires. I did my best to kill her, Woolf writes. My excuse, if I were to be had up in a court of law, would be that I acted in self-defense. I have complicated feelings about marriage, and I'm pretty sure I don't want children. For many people, this makes me less of a woman. I wonder sometimes why I feel attached to the word woman at all. I wonder why I can't separate myself from it like some people I know have been able to do. Sometimes I'm sure I want to, and sometimes I'm sure I don't. I'd like to think of myself as someone who refuses to participate in a system of gender entirely, and yet I still seek its labels and identifiers to help give me meaning, to help me feel like I belong. I still prefer the pronouns she and her, in part because I like the sound of them attached to me, and in part because I feel connected to them. But I also understand that this is in great part a product of socio-cultural learning, that from the second we are born, and in many cases long before, as in the obnoxious practice of gender reveal parties, we are called girl, we are called she, like my name, even though these words I was given don't always seem to fit, they still somehow feel like mine. I suspect this feeling of connection has something to do with my forebears, my Midwestern grandmother and great-grandmothers, strong women who worked the land, with my mother, a feminist and revolutionary in her own right, who burned her bra and protested the Vietnam War and argued with her father about his conservative politics and the evils of the patriarchy. My own identity as a woman, such as it is, was born of these women. When I think of myself as a woman, I think first of those who came before me. Perhaps, as Solnit writes in the title essay of The Mother of All Questions, there is no good answer to how to be a woman. The art may instead lie in how we refuse the question. According to the Bisexual Resource Center, nearly half of bisexual women have considered or attempted suicide, compared to just over a quarter of lesbians and gay men. Bisexuals also report higher rates of depression and anxiety compared to lesbians and heterosexual women. 1 in 2 bisexual women has experienced violence by an intimate partner, as opposed to 1 in 3 lesbians and 1 in 4 heterosexual women. Bisexual women are less likely to be bisexual women are less likely to be out to their doctors and families, and are more likely to have substance abuse issues. I count myself among these statistics. I've suffered from clinical depression and anxiety and have been in violent relationships, have a history of self-harm, and have struggled with substance abuse. Luckily, I also have the privilege my whiteness affords. I have access to health care, therapy, and a network of people I can talk to. Many other people, especially trans people and queer people of color, and especially in this country, while healthcare is still considered a privilege rather than a right, aren't so lucky. But the problem seems to be the same across race and socioeconomic status. If people, including and maybe especially those you count among your community, on whom you depend to lift you up and protect you, don't believe you exist, you might start to feel like you don't. A few years ago, I went to a doctor who told me to get off birth control. I'd been on the pill since I was 18, and it had started to cause what she described as pre-stroke symptoms. I guess I'll have to start using condoms, I said, half joking. She stopped typing up her notes and turned to look at me with a frown. Aren't you gay? She asked. I hesitated, a wave of panic rising up in my chest. I mean, I said, stammering, I'm bisexual, I guess, but my partner is a man. She rolled her eyes and sighed, then wagged a finger at me. See, she said, you people are the problem. After years of waging a war against my body, I'm finally starting to feel more at home with it, more at home in it. I still wish it was stronger, leaner. I still find myself sizing up the more girlish parts of my body, my thighs, from which I can never seem to shed that extra layer of fat, my stomach, which is never as hard as I want it to be, my breasts, which I wish were smaller than they are. I often wish I had no breasts at all. And sometimes I think about getting top surgery. I wonder, without breasts, if I might feel more complete in my body, more aligned with who I imagine myself to be. Sometimes I think if I could only shed myself of these remaining traces of girl, I would be even more myself. And if I am a woman, maybe I would feel even more like the woman I imagine myself to be. My partner and I are similar in shape and size. We look a little alike, wear each other's clothes, and have been mistaken on more than a few occasions for a gay couple. Sometimes I joke that I'm more of a man than a bisexual woman, but sometimes I wonder if there's more truth to that than I realize. And sometimes I feel like a fraud. Even though I don't pass as straight and don't consider myself to be in a strictly heterosexual relationship, I still feel that I often benefit from the privileges of one. Sometimes I feel like my body has become a lie. When John and I are together in public, sometimes I get uncomfortable. When I'm alone on the street, people can assume of me what they will, without the influence of another body next to mine. If they notice me at all, they'll almost certainly assume I'm queer. And this is the assumption I'd rather have people make. The read of me that feels right. Next to him, my body becomes more of a question. I asked John how he feels when he walks next to me, how he felt the day we hopped into a cab, and the driver asked us fellas where we were heading. I asked him how he sees me, how he feels it to be misread, and how it feels to be misread. Honestly, it doesn't bother me, he says, noting that he only gets angry on my behalf when I'm misgendered, because he knows how uncomfortable it makes me. But when I'm with you, he says, I'm just with you, a beautiful androgynous woman. To me, you've only ever been you. Sometimes I want to go home. I'm just not sure where that is anymore. I still call myself Midwestern, and in many ways I think I still am. I feel like I belong to a landscape that made me one of stillness and quiet, of trees and lakes and farmland, a place where I can hike in the woods and crunch through the snow and fill my lungs with fresh air. But does quiet necessitate more scrutiny? In small towns and rural spaces where I grew up, I feel more eyes on my body. With its androgynous shape and chosen childlessness, my body stands out. I am both a product of this place and a body that never quite fit in. In a city where there are more bodies that look like mine it's easier to pass unseen, and what freedom there is in the annihilation of identity. In her 1930 essay, Street Haunting, A London Adventure, Virginia Woolf writes of the anonymity a city affords, where one can step out onto a city street in the evening and pass through throngs of people unnoticed. Solnit examines this idea further in her essay, Wolf's Darkness, Embracing the Inexplicable, noting that Wolf is describing a form of society that doesn't enforce identity but liberates it. The society of strangers, the republic of the streets, the experience of being the republic of the streets, the experience of being anonymous and free that big cities invented. Now that I've lived in New York for more than a decade, I wonder if I'm more at home here than anywhere else I've been. I wonder if, paradoxically, I'm safer here. As much as I long to leave this city to return to the trees, to the land of my making, to the place I've always called home, I wonder if I might belong here instead. In 2017, following the election, I attended several rallies in New York. Two were particularly powerful. Sorry. The first was the Women's March in January, which protested, among other things, gender inequity and the inauguration of a president who has harassed, disparaged, and assaulted women. As I marched with 2 million other New Yorkers, I felt unquestionably like a woman, one who was angry, frustrated, and fed up with the way women are treated. A few months later, I went to the Dyke March. It's a protest march that began in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s and is held every year in cities throughout the country. It's unsponsored, unpermitted, and unprotected, an activist-led intersectional alternative to the increasingly corporate Pride Parade. I was nervous about going. A quiet fear crawled around inside me, telling me I wasn't queer enough to be there, that I certainly wasn't dyke enough, that if I met new people and told them I lived with a man, they'd kick me out of the parade. I like to see them try. And wouldn't I deserve that? But several of my friends, all of them queer women, had encouraged me to go, insisting I belonged. When I emerged from the subway, I stood outside the New York Public Library at Bryant Park, one of my favorite buildings in the city, and found myself among a massive crowd of bodies that looked a lot like mine. I spotted a friend, a lesbian, at the front of the line. She was serving as a marshal for the parade and was handing out signs and shirts to marchers. When she saw me, she smiled and called my name. Then she hugged me and handed me a shirt that said Dyke in big capital letters on the front. "I'm so happy you're here," she said. I tell my therapist about my non-date with a new friend. I tell her that despite our uncomfortable start at that oyster bar in Brooklyn, we've gone on to become quite close friends. I say it feels good to talk to this smart, queer woman who likes to discuss books and writing and queerness. I bet that was confusing for you, my therapist says. At first her words made me angry. I hear them At first her words make me angry. I hear them as an accusation, a suggestion that I've heard from so many queer women in my life, that I'm repressed or closeted or both. Then she tells me she thinks it's time I start to confront the internalized homophobia I've been carrying around for so long. I sit there for a second, shocked and still defensive. But as I leave her office that day and walk out into the sun, I begin to understand what she is asking of me, to interrogate this question about myself, which for most of my life has been much easier to avoid. But it turns out that when you spend your life surrounded by homophobia and biphobia, it's pretty easy to turn it on yourself, to question your body, your identity, your very existence in the world. Something else my therapist reminds me often is this: to live well is to speak one's truth, even if that truth is just a question. I write this on the property that once belonged to the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, in the barn she built from a Sears and Roebuck kit with her own hands.
Oh, cool.
Right, Dyke? Millay and her husband moved to this place in the foothills of the Taconic Mountains in upstate New York when they grew tired of the city. They moved here for the quiet, for the trees and the mountains, for the creek that wanders through the property. Millay preferred to go by the name Vincent. Her legacy over the years has been made into one of matronly nature sonnets, and it's true that her poetry was inspired by the walks she took in these mountains under these trees. But what's also true, a story that rarely gets told, is that Vincent was a gender nonconforming feminist and queer woman. She didn't necessarily write these labels, but she kept her hair short and wore suits and breeches and riding boots. She never had children. And her husband had an open marriage, and she kept both women and men as lovers. Over the years, people have tried to define Edna St. Vincent Millay, but to the people who knew and loved her, she was simply Vincent. I've stayed up here on the land she called home for the past 2 winters. It's a haven, a place where I can escape the city and return to the wilderness, where I can write and breathe in peace, and upstate New York is breathtaking in the fall. I'm here now in late February, staring out of my window in a barn at a landscape of untouched snow and the line of trees and the mountains beyond it as the sun sinks low over the horizon. Earlier today, I went for my daily hike in the woods. The crunch of my boots in the snow and the wind in the trees were the only sounds I heard. I peeked inside the window of Vincent's writing shack, then pressed on down a path into the woods. I walked along a trail that's dotted with her poems, stopping to read each one aloud, talking to the trees, listening to the creak and groan of branches, the rustling of dead leaves. And I feel safe here, as I'm sure Vincent did. At home here, as if I belong in this place, to these trees, to this land that holds my body sacred and holy and firm. In her 2005 essay collection, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, Rebecca Solnit writes, "To be lost is to be fully present, and to be fully present is to be capable of being in uncertainty and mystery." I like this idea of willfully inhabiting a question, to dwell in the realm of the unknown, of the indefinite and indefinable, and to know you might never find an answer. I'm starting to think this might just be the key to survival. So I'll take Solnit's advice and stop looking for answers. I'll keep trying to say things aloud, to use words even when I feel their limits. I'll remember that words, like us, are imperfect, are changing, are trying to do better. I'll remember that words can be resistance, that they can be a protest, that they can be used to liberate, to strengthen, to make visible those who have been unseen, that they can shed light on the darkness, that silence, as Audre Lorde wrote, is what kills us. Remember that saying, silence is death?
I do, yeah.
We had t-shirts that said that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll carry these words with me, not a burden, but a beacon. I'll use this torch, and I'll travel down this dark path of unknowing. I'll stay a while in this other world, in this in-between, this mystery, this ephemeral space of body and language and identity. And just try to be alive here. I'll keep my eyes open and listen, as Sylvia Plath wrote, to the old brag of my heart. I am, I am, I am. That's the end of this
The funny thing is,
essay.
not funny, but odd thing
Ironic?
is, yes, the last time they, both authors mentioned the same.
Yes. You mean Miss Carruthers and
Yes,
Miss Faliveno?
yeah, that's crazy. They did it again.
I think we're on a first name basis. We can call them Melissa and Carlene, don't you think?
Charlene, yeah. I think
I'm
so,
sorry,
yeah.
it was Carlene. I apologize,
Charlene Carruthers, yeah. But it's just odd to me, like, she's like obviously a totally white woman, and she's obviously a totally black woman,
Well, she's,
but they're going along similar lines on totally different subjects, but interestingly, like an intersection of topics.
yeah, and everybody goes out of their way to say something about Trump, which I do too.
I was gonna say, well, I think we all should be, because yeah, he's just a disgusting human. Oh, I thought you were getting something else out to read.
Oh, did you want me to?
No, I just thought you were.
Or do you want me to start reading one of the other?
11:15. I think that's a pretty good amount of time. I think we started at 10:15.
Would
So
you like me to read a poem from Audre Lorde?
if you have a poem you would like to read, otherwise, no, I think we're good.
Okay, I'm good then.
Okay.
I didn't have a poem prepared.
Yeah, I brought the book, but I didn't have one picked out either. So I think since we read kind of a long while, I think this is probably a good place to stop. So today is Tuesday. I don't think I mentioned that before, but we did have the start of the semester yesterday. I hope it was a smooth transition for everyone. I know these are challenging times, but I think if you reach out for help, there's help out there. If you need help with school, please let someone know. If you need help finding food in the community, please let us know. If you need shelter, please let us know. I have access to resources in the community. I can help you find where they are. Like, for example, just this morning, I read that in Boyle Heights, Milpa Grill on Caesar, they're giving out a $10 certificate for the census. If you haven't completed the census and you're in Boyle Heights, you can go there and get a $10 certificate. That would cover lunch at Milpa Grill, and their healthy food. It's fresh grilled, woman-owned business there in Boyle Heights. And so again, my name is Lynn. I'm a student services assistant at East Los Angeles College for One Zone, the coordinator for One Zone, our LGBTQ Student Support Center. Thank you for tuning in today. I'll be back tomorrow on, tomorrow's Wednesday at 3 o'clock on Facebook Live. I'll do some reading there as well. I'll probably read more from Unapologetic, since that's the book I'm reading right now. And Anne and I will be back on Tuesday.
Can never get it.
Where's the camera? Be back on Tuesday at 10 a.m. for another coffee hour where we'll discuss the resources that are available through One Zone, and we'll do some reading and some coloring probably again. So thank you so much for tuning in today. And I wish you peace and love wherever you are. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for letting me read.
Thank you for reading, baby.